So you've been told to thin your paints, but no one's told you how to do it? In your journeys around the hobby space here on YouTube, you may have heard several phrases such as too thin coats, consistency similar to skim milk, and obviously, thin your paints. But what exactly does that mean? How thin is thin? How thick is too thick? Let's dig into it and find out. The first thing that I want to go over is why should we thin our paint? If we're using miniature paint, don't the manufacturers know what we need and pre-package the exact product we're looking for? No. First off, there are multiple different techniques that require different consistencies or thickness and thinness of paint in order to properly execute. So we need to learn how to properly thin our paints and also to gauge that consistency in the context of whatever technique we're applying. Base coats are going to be thicker than layer coats. Layer coats are going to be thicker than glazes. Glazes are going to be thicker than washes. The reason why we thin the paint is to change its behaviors. Thinner paint will flow into cracks and crevices more readily. It'll also dry more transparently to allow more of the color beneath to show through. This is why our base layers will be a little bit thicker in order to cover up the primer than our layers for adding, say, highlights and shadow, because in those cases, we do want a little bit of that base color to come through that layer. And a glaze is going to be very, very thin, and a wash thinner still. Another benefit to thinning our paint, another reason why we do it, is that we don't want thick paint get pulled up in the sculpted details of the miniature and turn what is a nice textured surface into a completely flat surface. Some paint straight out the jar, or pot, or bottle, whatever the case may be, is so thick that if you put that on your miniature, it's going to look like a melted crayon. And we definitely do not want that to happen. So we thin our paint a bit, not to increase the transparency, but to dilute it so it flows around those sculpted details more readily and it doesn't cause buildup of paint to completely obscure or disfigure those details. So those are the two basic reasons why we thin our paint. Now, the degree to which we thin paint and how we thin that paint can have a huge impact on our miniature painting. There are three different techniques that I use commonly in my miniature painting that require three different consistencies of miniature paint. The first technique is the base coat, which is intended to cover up the primer as well as provide that color foundation that I'm going to work with when I create my shadows and my highlights on my miniature. And that's going to be the thickest consistency paint that I use because it's going to be the most opaque. The thicker the paint, the more opacity it has, which is generally true. There are some differences given different pigments, but that's more of an advanced subject and a little bit out of the scope of this video. Just remember, thicker paint is generally more opaque, thinner paint is generally more transparent. And with that base layer of paint, we're trying to establish a good, vibrant color that we're going to manipulate future layers for highlights and shadows. So it needs to be thick enough to have good opacity, but thin enough to not obscure the details. And I'll be showing you later in the video how we achieve that on the wet palette. The second technique I've mentioned before is layering paint up in value or down in value to create highlights and shadows. So we're going to start off by putting a base coat down, and then we're going to add transparent layers of different colors to shift the brightness and darkness of that base coat, depending on if the piece of the model we're painting is in a highlight and a shadow, or if it's in a mid-tone and we're just trying to smooth out that gradation between the pure mid-tone and the deepest shadow or the highest highlight. Finally, glazing is a technique that I use to kind of smooth out the edges between layers. And that requires a very thin, consistent paint because it's going to be largely transparent. Glazing is for very subtle shifting of the value or hue of a color. Yes, Angel. No, I'm not trying to record a video here. I know. You have something very important to share with YouTube, don't you? Yeah. Can I continue now? You sure? You know I only have a 30-minute timer before it stops recording, right? And I don't have any way of monitoring that. So the last technique I use is called glazing. Glazing is designed to make very subtle shifts in either value or hue of a layer beneath it. So it needs to be very, very transparent, which means we need to mix the paint very thinly. There are some nuances to this technique, of course, with anything else, but generally we're going to add more water to a glaze than we would to a layer consistency paint, and we would add more water to a layer than we would to a base coat. So now that we understand a little bit about the why we thin our paint, let's spin over to the hobby desk here, and let's work through actually thinning some paint down for different applications. So to thin your paint, we're going to start off by putting an amount of paint from our tube or our bottle on our palette, and then we are going to load up our brush with a little bit of water or you can use a medium such as Vallejo's Glaze Medium to thin your paint with instead. All we're looking to do is take the paint from the initial consistency down to a, forgive me for this phrasing, but consistent consistency, because not all paint manufacturers or even colors within the same range from the same manufacturer are going to have the same starting consistency. So we want to make sure everything is pretty much equal. The amount of water or medium we use is going to be dependent on how thin we want the resulting mix to be. Once we add that medium or that water to the paint, we just simply take our brush and we mix until thoroughly combined. So how do we know when we reach the proper consistency? Well, for a base layer, we're going to take a little bit of paint on our brush and we're going to take place a stroke against our skin. What we're looking for is to be able to see the texture of our skin through the paint, but not have any of the color of our skin showing through the paint. We also definitely do not want to see ridges on the edge of the stroke. So if you think of a snow plow plowing snow down the street and you have those ridges on the side of the plow where the snow is being cast off, we don't want to see those kind of ridges. So to recap the base consistency, we want to see the texture of our skin, but not the color of our skin showing through that stroke, and we don't want to see any texture being added by the paint from that stroke. To test for a proper layer consistency, we want to take a stroke on our skin and we want to see obviously the texture before, but we also want to see some of the color of our skin coming through. We just want to make a slight shift in the color of our skin. And when we go for our glaze consistency, we want to see most of the color of our skin showing through with a slight tinting of the color we are glazing with. And there you have it, a complete guide to thinning your paints for the 3 most common miniature paint techniques. I hope you got some value from this video, and if you did, consider subscribing to the channel, and here's another video right here that you may like just as much. I'll see you in the next one.